Okay, so we are now live, and I'll be staying here for 5 to 10 minutes to help out learners if they have any technical issues.
Okay. So you will not be on through the whole class.
Nope.
Okay, good.
So I'm gonna walk with you back to my office.
Good evening, Sandy. You're on mute. Hi, Chris. And Sandy and another Sandy. We have two Sandys. We have Chip and Chris. Hi, Arthur.
Hi, Russ.
Hi, Leslie. Welcome.
Hi there, Russ.
Good to have you all here this evening. How's everybody this evening?
Good. That's fine.
Anybody out on a bike ride today by chance? Wondering if we had any cyclists here. We should.
Yeah.
Great. Where are you from, Chris?
I live in Maine,
Where in Maine?
Green, outside of Lewiston, Auburn. So maybe just in between Portland and Augusta.
I do know where that is because my son teaches at Bates College and he he lives in Lewiston. They just bought a house in Auburn.
Nice. Yeah. I'm about 5-7 miles from College Road from Bates campus. So
Are you west of campus? Or east?
A little north.
Oh, I know where Green is. I think I may have biked up that direction.
Yeah. Yeah. Actually, I biked when I biked today. I was in Lewiston right by Bates for an eye appointment anyway. So I rode out that way and you go in towards Monmouth and whatever on College Road.
Yeah, I took a big loop up to, I can't remember the name of the roads now, but we ended up, eventually there's a cidery called, it's up on a hillside. It's on a remote road, dirt road you have to get to anyway.
That's right off my road. It's Wicker. It's fairly new, but yeah.
Yes, it is fairly new. It's on a farm.
Yeah.
And they do weddings there. It was a lovely
They
place.
do.
I lost a watch on the road. The road is so rough coming down, and I hit a point sometimes when you're going fast, and it is riskier to try to brake than to just go with it.
It is.
If you brake, there's always a chance your wheels will slide out from underneath you.
Yeah.
So I just went with it. Got home, my watch was missing. I think it just bounced off my wrist.
Hi,
Welcome,
everybody.
everyone.
Who's from Maine?
I am.
Chris.
Hi, how do you do? I did bike Maine a few years ago.
Oh, good. Which one?
I don't remember what year, maybe 2014, 15, something like that.
Nice.
was
Whereabouts in Maine did you ride? Was that the coast?
The best part about it was we go to Maine every summer for the last 30 some years, but always up the coast. And this was a part of Maine I'd never been to. It was from Portland up north a little bit to Norway and then down to Booth Bay.
Yeah.
And around that area. It was wonderful. It was terrific.
Yeah, they do a great job. I did the
Don't mind
one.
me eating.
The year after I retired, because I was in education, so I could never do it. But I did the one in Aroostook County, and I had lived in the county, so it's right in northern Maine. It's on the Canadian border.
I know,
we did.
That's in wilderness. That's wilderness there.
I lived there quite a while ago. I went to college for a year and a half up there, so it was kind of fun to be back. But it was
And so the
great
40 years I've been going to Maine, I've never seen a moose.
Oh. Well, head towards the Bigelows or the Waters or whatever. Where do you come to in Maine?
Mostly up to Mount Desert. Mostly.
Well, it's good to have everyone this evening.
I'll let you go. Thanks.
No, that's okay. I think we might have some folks that are new to get set up tonight, which is great. And if you are new, you are really welcome. I advertise this class on some Facebook groups because love to get wider circulation, wider information about the Great Allegheny Passage. I'm a Great Allegheny Passage enthusiast, among other enthusiasms that I have in life. But I've done this class several times, and it is, well, you'll find out. It's, in my opinion, the premier rails to trails in the U.S. That doesn't mean there aren't better. I just haven't ridden enough to find one yet that was better. Just commenting on John and Chris's discussion of Maine, there is something called the East Coast Greenway, which starts on the border of Maine and Canada and goes down ideally all the way to Key West, Florida, connecting rails, paths, rails to trails, basically getting people off the road. And I actually found a little piece of that in Lewiston when I was there last summer. There's a section that goes along the river. It's kind of funny. But there were the East Coast Greenway signs, and I was really thrilled to come across those. So I'm glad to have all of you with us tonight. I'm going to go ahead and start. I'm going to do a little screen share here because I'm going to share photos and things about this trip, the Great Allegheny Passage. And just a few things to mention at the beginning. If you have questions tonight, please put them in the chat. I will also have time at the end to stop and answer questions. But if you put questions in the chat, I'll try to check those out while I'm making a presentation, see if I can answer them. But the chat is the best way to get your questions in. And then again, there'll be open Q&A at the end. Really glad to have you all with us tonight on Get Set Up. I'm Russ Eanes, your guide. I'm from Harrisonburg, Virginia. That's in Western Virginia, not to be confused with West Virginia. Harrisonburg is about 2 hours southeast of Washington, D.C. And I'm a little under 2 hours from several points on the Cno Towpath, which is part of what we'll be talking about tonight, because this route follows two of the great bike trails in America, the Great Allegheny Passage and the Cno Towpath. And so I can get up to it, but I've biked the whole thing for the first time last summer. And well, you'll find out later as I talk about cycling, but I am a writer, a walker, and a cyclist. Former life, I was a book publisher, loved to help people shape their ideas into books. And now I'm a full-time guide with Get Set Up. Just love the energy that I get from working with older learners. Get Set Up is a place where you can come and learn skills from people like you. All the instructors or guides, as we're known, are over 55. So if you have something you want to learn, the guide is going to be your age. And we have everything you might want to know at Get Set Up. So if you're new, please go and check out the site and take a look at all the classes that are offered. We offer about 50 different classes a day. And right now, those classes are all free. So you can take as many as you want. We learn from each other in these classes. So ideally, you have your camera on. We can see each other. You can request a recording of this class after it's over. You email help@GetSetUp, and they will give you a recording of the class, which is a reminder to me to make sure I turn the recording button on, and I did that. And you can also join some of our classes by live stream. Tonight's class is live streaming, so people are able to watch it on YouTube and on the Get Set Up channel. If anyone is joining by live stream, we always have a few people. The best way to participate is to join in, and then you can ask questions in live time. And lastly, Get Set Up's not paid to promote any specific products. We're strictly an educational organization. The Great Allegheny Passage and the Cno Towpath stretch 335 miles from Pittsburgh to Washington, D.C. It is, in my opinion, probably the premier rails to trails experience in the U.S. This, by the way, if anyone has been on the Great Allegheny Passage, is the Salisbury Viaduct. It's the longest bridge on the Great Allegheny Passage, or the Cno Towpath. Goes over the Castleman River and Route 219 shortly before you enter Meyersdale, PA. Up in the Allegheny Highlands, as I like to say. To give you an idea what it's like, this is a map of the route. You can either start, well, first of all, you can jump on these trails anywhere. There are numerous railheads, and that's one reason why I love this route so much. They've built lots of trailheads in there, so you can drive your car up, hop off, and ride as far as you want or as little as you want. But if you want to ride from one end to the other, you can either start in Pittsburgh, and you'll see where that is, at the where the route starts at the point in Pittsburgh. And from there, it's 150 miles to Cumberland, Maryland, which it goes over the Allegheny Mountains, over the Eastern Continental Divide. And there, it picks up the Cno Towpath and goes into Washington, D.C. And so it's 150 miles from Pittsburgh to Cumberland, 185 miles from Cumberland to Washington, D.C. And it is all along rivers. In Pittsburgh, you start out on the Monongahela, then you pick up the Yakigani River, then you get on the Castleman River, and finally Flaherty's Creek before you cross over and find yourself heading down into Cumberland, and you come alongside Wills Creek. And at Cumberland, you pick up the Potomac River, which you take all the way into Washington, D.C. To give you an idea of the elevation, because some people get nervous when they hear about biking in Western Pennsylvania. Let me tell you, I have lived in Western Pennsylvania for over 30 years. I don't live there now, but I live in a little bit farther south. I live in I can look at the Allegheny Mountains from the other side where I live in Western Virginia. You can't ride anywhere in Pennsylvania without going around a curve or over a hill. It just doesn't exist. It isn't possible unless you're following the Great Allegheny Passage, which runs along the river. They built all these railroads that now the bike path from Pittsburgh to Cumberland is on top of the old railroad bed. They built them along rivers, so they're flat. And even though there's an elevation gain from Pittsburgh, which starts out at 720 feet, to the Eastern Continental Divide, which is just shy of 2,400 feet, that's about 1,700 foot gain, or a little over 500 meters. And then it drops down into Cumberland, Maryland, which is 605 feet. So you're almost just a little bit lower than you were in Pittsburgh. And then from there down to Washington, D.C., which is sea level. It is flat the whole way. The elevation gain is so small, you wouldn't know it. You do know when you're biking from the Eastern Continental Divide down to Cumberland, you do know it's a 1.5% grade downhill because it's very easy pedaling. But if you're someone who would like to go the other direction, start in Washington and go to Pittsburgh, the climb out of Cumberland to up through Frostburg to the Eastern Continental Divide to Meyersdale is not that difficult. You go a little slower. I did it with my 12-year-old son over just several hours. So it's not to be intimidated. I realize when they crunch elevations together in a map, it looks scary. The other thing the reason I like biking from Pittsburgh to Washington is even though there's an elevation gain from Pittsburgh to Meyersdale in the Eastern Continental Divide, you have the westerly winds behind you because in Western Pennsylvania, the winds do tend to come from the west. So you may be going up in elevation, but you got the wind behind you. I like to say that the Great Allegheny Passage and the Cno Towpath are about rivers, railroads, and mountains. That, by the way, is my son when he was 12, when he climbed from Cumberland to the Eastern Continental Divide. If you're going from Pittsburgh to Washington, you start out of the Monongahela River, which is, I'll show you a picture of it in a minute. It's one of the great American rivers. And later you pick up for most of the way, actually, this river, which is the Yakigani, which is a beautiful wild river. These are all Indian names, Monongahela and Yakigani. And then you pick up in the town of Confluence, the Castleman River, which takes you up to the Meyersdale, and then you pick up a creek. But then when you get to Cumberland, you get on the Potomac River. So you are draining, these rivers drain the Allegheny Mountains, which form most of West Virginia and Western Pennsylvania, two different directions. Of course, the Allegheny and the Monongahela flow into the Ohio and go west. When you cross over the Continental Divide and you get on the Wills Creek and then the Potomac River, you're heading toward the Atlantic coast. But they're all draining the Allegheny Mountains. So those are the mountains you have to cross through. And let me tell you, I've lived in and around them most of my life, and they're beautiful. When I say it's about railroads, the Great Allegheny Passage is on the old Western Maryland Railroad line, which ran generally on the south bank of these rivers. On the north bank, there's an active railroad still there. It's called the CSX. Before that, it was called the Chessie System. Before that, it was called the C&O. And before that, it was called the B&O Railroad. They're Baltimore and Ohio. That was the first major railroad in America, and it ran from Baltimore, Maryland to Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. And that line is basically still in use today. And of course, there are the Allegheny Mountains, which are like, if you imagine taking a blanket and kind of ruffling it up and shoving it so you get all these little lumps, that's what the Allegheny Mountains are like. They literally were formed by the collision of the big tectonic plates under the Earth's surface many millions of years ago. people out west in the Rockies boast about how big their mountains are, and they put down the Alleghenies because they're so small. And I just say the Rocky Mountains are Allegheny Mountain wannabes, because the Alleghenies are many millions of years older. And as they have eroded, most of what was in the Alleghenies has ended up as sand on the eastern coast of the United States. This scene right here is a famous spot just outside the Big Savage Tunnel, about 20 miles from Cumberland, part of that long climb or long downhill if you take it the other direction. And this little kind of white spot in the middle of the picture is called the Narrows, and that's where Wills Creek comes in to Cumberland. So that's where you're actually riding on when you're in this picture. I started my trip on the Saturday of Labor Day weekend in 2020. And I spent a week cycling it from Pittsburgh to Washington, D.C. This, just so give you an idea when I did it. This is a group of cyclists heading over one of the many railroad bridges that has been converted into a bicycling bridge. This is over the Monongahela River, just south, about 15 miles away from Pittsburgh. As I was traveling, I stayed in a mixture of lodgings, from Airbnbs to bed and breakfasts to hotels, and there are many places to stay along the way, every 10 or 15 miles at the very least. You can also camp. The Cno Towpath, which by the way is a national park, has campgrounds about every 5 miles. There are also campgrounds along the Great Allegheny Passage, but there are more towns there. So I prefer, if I'm going along there, to stay in the bed and breakfasts, in the inns, and the hotels. This is a famous one. This is in Town Hill. This is the Town Hill Inn. This is way up on top of one of the Allegheny ridges. And I stayed there one night. It was actually about a 7-mile climb from the Cno Towpath, so I got a shuttle ride up there. I probably could have done it, but it was fun learning how the shuttle goes, because a lot of people at the end of a long day of cycling don't want to do a long climb uphill. I understand. My cost for the trip was about $100 a day, and that included buying food for my own breakfasts and lunches when needed. I ate out in the evenings, but otherwise there are plenty of places to stop and get something to eat. There are also grocery stores along the way, so if you want to just buy some fruit or other things for fixing your own food, which I like to do, they're very convenient. I personally have lived within a few miles or a few hours of the Great Allegheny Passage since it was first begun in 1986. And I've ridden parts of it more times than I can count, because when you only live 5 or 6 miles away, you get over there and you ride that trail a lot. I've also been a guide on the Great Allegheny Passage for the Rhodes Scholars program, several times going from Cumberland to Pittsburgh. And I decided I was going to pedal it in 2020 as sort of a safe way to take a trip. I travel a lot, and I actually teach a lot of travel classes for Get Set Up. I'm also a hiker and a walker. I walked the Camino de Santiago in 2018 and biked the end to end, or the Land's End to John O'Groats, which is one end of the United Kingdom to the other, about 1,000 miles. Also did that in 2018. But one of my great loves is the Great Allegheny Passage. And I said in 2020, I needed to be able to take a trip that's safe. And biking outdoors certainly was safe last year, still is, and a lot of fun and good exercise. And I could think of nothing better to do than to go to Pittsburgh, which I'd always longed to do, and bike all the way down to Washington, which I hadn't done before. This is just a throwback in time. This was back in 2010. That is my youngest son, who's now 23, and he was just 12 then. And he biked with me from Cumberland to Pittsburgh. And the first day he did that long climb up from Cumberland over the Eastern Continental Divide all the way to the town of Ohiopal, which is about halfway on the Great Allegheny Passage. So he did 75 miles. It's not that hard. There are numerous trailheads for jumping on any section of this ride, as I mentioned before. But if you want to start at the western terminus, you start at the point in Pittsburgh. This is where the Allegheny and the Monongahela rivers come and form the Ohio. So if you've ever been there, this is the point in Pittsburgh. And there's a little spot, a little marker in the pavement down here that says it's the beginning or the end of the Great Allegheny Passage, these huge water fountains going up. This is where the Allegheny River comes, and it is a huge river, comes all the way down from New York State even. And this is the Monongahela River, which comes from West Virginia eventually, again, a very large river. Together they meet and they form the Ohio. The Ohio, as the crow flies, is only about 500 miles to Cairo, Illinois, where it meets the Mississippi. But it doesn't go as the crow flies. It bends and twists and goes north and south and goes over 900 miles before it meets the Mississippi. This spot was the most coveted place in the early American colonial story because the British and the French both wanted it because they wanted to get to the Ohio Valley to go eventually to the Mississippi to dominate the interior of the country. Quick history, this is where the French and Indian War began. And some people would say that the French and Indian War was continued in the American Revolution. So it sort of began here back in 1754 when some of George Washington, yes, that George Washington, he was a colonel in the British, the Virginia militia, came up here, and one of his trigger-happy men accidentally killed the Count du Jumonville and launched the French and Indian War. The British eventually won. Fort Duquesne was here once upon a time. The British renamed it Fort Pitt. That's where the name Pittsburgh comes from. Pittsburgh also became known in America as a mighty industrial city, producing more steel than any other place. That's why it's known as Steel City. That's where we get the Steelers from, the Pittsburgh Steelers. Actually, this is the Pittsburgh Steelers Stadium right over here across the Allegheny River. This is the view a little bit farther back of Pittsburgh. Pittsburgh has, because it's so hilly, has a big sort of mountain on this side. And up here is Grandview Avenue. And if you go up along Grandview, there are many places you can pull over, and they have spots you can get out and walk and get great views of the city. It has, in my opinion, an incomparable view of the city. So it's just a fabulous place to start your ride. If you want to know what kind of gear I had, I rode my Specialized Sequoia, which is called an adventure / gravel bike, which can handle all sorts of terrains. I use it for everything from riding the gravel roads around here to riding into town and commuting or picking up groceries. I also have road bike because it's great road biking around here. For this trip, I carried two 20-liter panniers. That's the yellow bags on the back of my bike. And they were loaded with a total of about 35 pounds of gear, which was really too much in my opinion. I walked the Camino de Santiago, that's 500 miles, with just 16 pounds. So I really didn't need all this stuff. But it's easier to bike with weight than it is to walk with weight. However, I was doing research for a book I'm writing, and I also carried along food. I also had a handlebar bag in the front. My handlebar bag has one of these little plastic windows on it. So I like to put the map in there and see where I'm going as I go along. And I'll show you the map later when we're all back together that you can pick up and take with you. I really recommend it. That's all my gear laid out in bed. Basically had a couple of days change of clothes. And when you're biking, you mostly just need cycling gear, which is jerseys and shorts, some clothes for the evening, something to sleep in, some underwear, and then, of course, bike tools and bike parts. Maybe that's part of what added to my weight. And of course, I had a bunch of guidebooks along with me because since I'm writing a book, I wanted to look at what some of the history that the guidebooks might have. Because I've lived in Western Pennsylvania so long, and I have been a guide on the Great Allegheny Passage, of course, I know a lot of the history along there. These are the things that I think you have to have. This is the trail guide. A new one comes out every year. And in the trail guide, you get a free map on one side of the map. It's a very long, skinny map. I'll show you later, is the Great Allegheny Passage. On the other side of the map is the Cno Towpath. So you can fold it up and you can look at the section of the trail that you're on. It is waterproof, so you don't have to worry about getting rained on or dropping it in one of the rivers if you get a little too close. As I said about the trail guides, a new one comes out every year. They're just $10. Unfortunately, there isn't like a stand at each end where you begin and end your ride that they will sell these guidebooks. You have to buy them online. There are places in Pittsburgh where you can get them. And if you're along the Great Allegheny Passage, there are quite a few visitor centers right along the trail where they have them. The Great Allegheny Passage follows the Pittsburgh and Lake Erie Railroad and the Western Maryland Railroad, these old railroads, for 150 miles to Cumberland, Maryland, and it's paved with crushed limestone and is well drained. So when I say it follows the railroads, of course, follow the rivers. So the first 15 miles from Pittsburgh to Mckeesport is along the Monongahela River, that huge river. Mckeesport is where the Yakigani River comes into the Monongahela River. Got all these Indian names? And from there, you go a long way until you reach the Castleman River. These railroad beds were, again, along the river channels. So that's why they're so flat. And of course, the rivers cut through the mountains. You go through several gorges, which are gorgeous. And because it's an old railroad bed, the railroad beds were built to be well drained. So they're a bit lifted up off the terrain around them. They have a lot of good crushed stone underneath. And then on top of that, they put this crushed limestone. And every year, volunteers come out and resurface sections of the road, of the trail, I should say. I find, and then they repack it, they kind of roll it. I find that crushed limestone is about the most pleasant thing to bike on. I like it better than biking on asphalt. It's very smooth. You just hear the crunch of your tires as you go over it. And in many sections like here, it's in the open and it's very straight, but you do go through a lot of curves because the river takes a lot of curves as it goes through all those hills of Western Pennsylvania. I began the journey at the point with some family members who came up for the weekend to see me off. My son and two of my grandsons and my daughter and her husband joined me. I'm standing with my back to the Ohio River. So I'm at the point in Pittsburgh, and that's where the Ohio then flows 900 some miles to the Mississippi. The first 15 miles out of Pittsburgh are paved asphalt. This is where the Great Allegheny Passage starts on the north bank of the Monongahela. Then it cuts over to the south bank of the Monongahela at the Hot Metal Bridge. And where I'm standing, which is a beautiful spot with a marina and with condos and shopping, all this used to be steel mills. Wasn't anywhere near as nice 50 years ago as it is now. They have completely changed Pittsburgh. Almost all the steel mills and everything that was there is gone. And what was always a beautiful place has become beautiful again. The Great Allegheny Passage has 4 tunnels and numerous bridges. The longest tunnel is 3,300 feet, and that tunnel is lit with lights. This is not the longest tunnel. This is the Pinkerton Tunnel, which is actually one of the last tunnels that they opened. Most people don't realize it, but you can't just abandon a railroad in this country. If a company has been given the rights to build a railroad, when they want to abandon it, they have an obligation to the state. And so the Western Maryland Railroad was purchased by the Cno back in the 1950s. Actually, it might have even been earlier than that. And finally, they decided, essentially the Cno bought out its competitor. They were on each side of the river. And eventually the Cno decided to put the Western Maryland out of business entirely and abandon it. But it would have been very expensive because they would have to close and seal each of the tunnels, and they would have to have removed every single one of the bridges because bridges decay and fall in, and the companies that put them there are responsible for them. So rather than do that, the Western Pennsylvania Conservancy bought the Western Maryland Railroad for $1 with a vision of building a rails to trails. And I love that vision. It started in the early 70s. The first 10 miles was built in the 1980s, and they kept on building it until it was completed just about a decade ago. Most of it was completed in the early 2000s when they opened the Big Savage Tunnel. That's this tunnel right here. This is the one that's 3,300 feet. This is actually in Maryland. But the last sections they had to complete were actually around the city of Pittsburgh. There were so many properties that they needed to get right-of-ways around. I think the last one was the amusement park or water park sandcastle that gave them the right-of-way for about a half a mile of passage along their property. All along the Great Allegheny Passage, there are historical markers. They're also on the Cno Towpath. And I recommend anyone who rides it to take the time to stop and read the historical markers. There's a spot that has a lot of history around it, the Battle of Homestead, actually a labor battle, a very famous labor battle between the Steelworkers Union and Andrew Carnegie and Frick, the Henry Clay Frick, who was the president of the company. And they're both famous or infamous in the region because they were some of the big robber barons from the late 19th century who made a fortune in steel, coal, and coke. And there was a big labor battle there, and you can stop and read about it there at the Homestead, where they fought the Battle of Homestead, which is an enormous steel plant. There are also places along the line that mark mine disasters. This is the Dar Mine Disaster, where 239 miners were killed. And the spot is completely covered over now. It's wooded. You would have no idea if you pedal past it that inside there was a former mine that is also, in a sense, the tomb of 239 men who died inside. They were not unable to recover them. And it's a reminder that there was industry all along here, big industry, and the industry also devastated the river. The Yakigani River used to be sterile. There were no trout in it, for example, because of acid mine runoff. The rivers have recovered, but and you hardly can see any of the remains of the old industry along there. But every now and then you come along on a marker like this, and you're reminded of what this place once was. This person is standing by up in the woods, the remains of a coke oven. Coke ovens were these beehive-shaped ovens, probably about 7 or 8 feet high, and they poured coal in the top and they lit them on fire with no oxygen, and they slowly burned until the coal became like 99% pure carbon. And then they shoveled all that out and they put them in railroad cars and they took it up to Pittsburgh, where they made steel. They used them in the blast furnaces in steel. And the region that you actually bike through on the Great Allegheny Passage once was home to 50,000 coke ovens. The Yakigani is a beautiful wild river, and many times you are reminded of the river because you can hear it rushing by you when you go through this is a part of the gorge they call the Yakigani Gorge, as it cuts through Chestnut Ridge and Laurel Ridge. That's in the Ohiopal State Park, which is about halfway or 70 to 80 miles from Pittsburgh. It is my favorite part along the Great Allegheny Passage. It's wild, it's beautiful. It goes through woods. If you're there right now, in fact, if you would be there on the trail in May, you would see hillsides full of white trillium. I like to ride it in the fall. When I did it, I rode in Labor Day, and I would say late August through late September are excellent times to ride because there are a lot of fall wildflowers out. But it's just gorgeous. It's very wild. In fact, there's a section of it about 16 miles that's complete wilderness. So there's no place to stop. So if you have a problem, you're kind of stuck in the middle of nowhere. Fortunately, there are a lot of riders going by, so someone can help you. When you're cycling through Ohiopal State Park, you also get a lesson in geology. And there are, by the way, historical and natural markers along there that point out the geological formations that have been cut away by the river. There's a big coal seam at one point. I always love to stop at the coal seam and look for a piece of coal. The most dramatic bridges are in Ohiopal and Meyersdale, and this is the Ohiopal High Bridge. It's nearly 100 feet high. The Western Maryland Railroad ran over here. And when you're cycling from Pittsburgh, you come in at this end right here. And of course, it's a great place to stop and get photos. But the most dramatic is when you can get down on the river where I am and you look up at the bridge. And it is, of course, in the town of Ohiopal. And Ohiopal is probably the premier whitewater rafting spot in the eastern United States. So as you can see a few people out here in a raft the day that I went by. This is what it looks like from the top of the bridge, and people always like to stop. If you're afraid of heights, don't worry. It's well secured on the sides. I couldn't have imagined ever walking across it without all those side rails, or even going across it on a train without the side rails. Would have just felt too scary for me. I don't like heights. There were lots of kayakers in the river. In fact, I was there on the Saturday of Labor Day going into, I was on the Sunday of Labor Day going into Ohiopal. And I've rarely seen Ohiopal this crowded. I think a lot of people wanted to get out, but normally Ohiopal on a summer weekend into fall is crowded with people that come and go whitewater rafting or kayaking. At the other end of the when you're coming into the town of Ohiopal, there is this long, low bridge, I should call it. Back when I lived in the area, just a few miles from Ohiopal, this bridge had been removed and they rebuilt it more recently. All the bridge piers down here were still intact. And this is just above the This is coming into the town of Ohiopal, and it's just above the Ohiopal Falls. Along the way, the Great Allegheny Passage gradually gains in elevation until it crosses the Eastern Continental Divide, which is about 23 miles from Cumberland, and there it's a 1.5% downhill grade until you reach Cumberland. This is Cumberland, and the Cno Towpath runs from Cumberland to Washington, and it has an elevation drop of 600 feet, but you only know it when you reach a lock. Otherwise, it's completely flat. So this is just starting out on the Cno Towpath, heading towards Washington, D.C., and it's turning around and looking back north at Cumberland. And you can see this big notch in the mountains right here. This is where the Great Allegheny Passage comes down into Cumberland. And this down here is the North Branch of the Potomac River. Just to give you again an idea of that elevation gain. So when we went from Pittsburgh to Cumberland, we went slowly up in elevation to the Eastern Continental Divide and then dropped down into Cumberland. This is now what you follow on. You are on the left bank of the Potomac River all the way into Washington, D.C. The Cno Canal was constructed over 2 decades in the early to mid 19th century as a way to transport goods from the Ohio to the Potomac. It was conceived of as the idea is they would build this canal along the river. The river would supply water for the canal, and they would get from Washington, D.C. to Cumberland, and they would find a way to hoist the boats or somehow get the goods over the mountains, over just the Eastern Continental Divide. And then they would drop them into a new canal on the other side and take it all the way into Pittsburgh. But long before they could get even to Cumberland, the railroad beat them. So ironically, the canal was obsolete by the time it was completed. There's a picture of what a canal boat looked like. The canal boats were constructed to fit exactly into the side of the canal, and they were built so that 2 could pass each other. And mules dragged the canal boats along the towpath, and that is what you ride nowadays. So that is different than the railroad bed because it's a towpath, it's built on dirt, and because it's very low and alongside the river, it was also subject to flooding. And it was that flooding which happened frequently enough along the Cno Canal, which, in addition to the railroad, basically made them abandon the canal by the early 1900s. Too many floods, too much destruction, too much reconstructing. Most of the canal is a double track, the towpath, but here's an example where it just gets down to one narrow path. You basically ride along dirt or gravel roads. It's very pleasant, but you do need to have bigger tires. If you have a bike with suspension, that's even better. It's a little bit more comfortable. I have big fat tires, 42 millimeters, so I was quite comfortable riding it. The first day when you leave Cumberland and head south, you go through a very remote stretch. There aren't any towns except for this little place where this woman is in Old Town, where there's really nothing more than the old school. And she runs a cafe out of the old school. I understand that the old school is going to be made into a hostel for people to stay. That's really nice. It's about 20 to 25 miles down from Cumberland to reach Old Town. The main features of the Cno are its locks and viaducts and its tunnel, the Pawpaw Tunnel. Yes, the canal has a tunnel. There was a section of the canal that was about 5 miles where the river just kept going back and forth, meandering around hills, and it was going to be a long way to build the canal. So they decided they'd take a shortcut and tunnel through the mountain, run the water and the canal through the mountain. Not a bad idea, except for that in practice, it didn't work out quite that way. This is me at the northern edge of the Pawpaw Tunnel. So, pardon me, you can't quite tell, but the canal is over here on my left, and the canal actually runs through the tunnel, and there's a small towpath on the right-hand side. You come out the other end, and looking back, you can barely see the light at the other end. It is not as light inside as it may appear from this photograph. Actually, when you are in the middle of the tunnel, it is pitch black. So you have to have a light because there are no lights in the tunnel. I had a light on my bike. I've heard of people that walk through it without lights. I have no idea why they do that because there's water over this side rail if something happens and you fall in. I don't think you drown, but certainly wouldn't want to fall into the water. Currently, the Pawpaw Tunnel is closed because at this end, the southern end where I'm standing taking the photograph, there are rocks, and they're doing repair work there to keep rock sides from coming in and covering up the path. So it's closed, at least as I understand it, until next summer. However, you can go around it. There is a trail that goes up and over the mountain down to the other side. It gives you, you have to take longer to do that. However, if you are at the other end, so back of this is the north end where I'm standing, that's actually open. You can go in there and walk in the tunnel if you want. It's a great thing to see. The canal also has numerous viaducts. These are places where the rivers or creeks were too wide for them to build a culvert underneath. So they simply built a viaduct to carry the water over the river. So again, if you can imagine the strange thing of cutting a tunnel through the mountain to run the water, they've now cut a bridge to carry the water over a river. The most beautiful of these is the Monacasi Viaduct, which covers the, actually, I think this is the Capicon, which is a very wide river. Very beautiful stonework they did. And you can ride through these. There's no water in them anymore, but they're beautiful to ride over. Every few miles, actually about every 3 miles on average, there's a lock. The locks take the elevation of the canal down about 8.5 feet. Many of the locks are intact. Some of them, like this one, there's just some stonework left, but you come across these locks everywhere. There are also lock keeper houses. The locks were manned by a lock keeper and his family, and they had a small plot of land to farm, and otherwise he was paid to come out and open the locks and let the boats up or down, whichever, depending on which direction they were traveling. And because it was a canal, the water had to be kept level in between the locks. That's why I say when you're on the Cno Towpath, you are just riding level until you get to a lock. Depending which way you go, you either drop down 8 feet or you climb up 8 feet, but it's very simple. And some of the lock houses actually are still in use for camping or staying in, I guess. They're lodging. You can rent one of them and stay in it overnight. It's fairly rustic, but I've heard they're very nice. This is typical of what you see when the canal has water in it. The canal doesn't have water in it anymore the whole way. There are places where there's no water at all, but other places you come along, the canal's still filled. It's kind of a unique ecosystem. There's no boats or anything going through it anymore, so it's gone back to nature. The canal is a little bit rough. The towpath along the canal is a little bit rough. It's rocky and stony, and there are occasional tree roots, but it's also just beautiful. It's very remote, and you don't realize you're getting that close to Washington, D.C. There are many towns that stop in along the way. So if you're biking from Cumberland to Washington, there's towns about every 30, 40 miles or closer, even sometimes 10 or 15 miles apart. This is Shepherdstown, West Virginia, which is the spot where I stopped to have a lunch. It's about 10 miles from Harpers Ferry. This is Harpers Ferry, which, by the way, is a very steep place, also a very historic place. That whole town of Harpers Ferry is actually a national park. And if you are visiting there, not on bike, like if you drive there, there is a visitor center a few miles outside of town where you can park your car and they will shuttle you into town. That's to keep down the traffic in town. But I arrived by bike. And of course, the canal is on the other side of the river from Harpers Ferry. Harpers Ferry is where the Shenandoah River, which drains the Shenandoah Valley, where I currently live, meets the Potomac River. It's one of the most dramatic spots along the entire Potomac River. And Harpers Ferry is a place that I would say, if you're riding and you have an extra day, I'd spend 2 nights at Harpers Ferry and spend a day looking around town. There's also excellent hiking because there are places like this. This is on the Maryland side or the north side of the river from Harpers Ferry. Maryland Heights, you can hike up there. I've been up there many times myself. You get a fabulous view of Harpers Ferry from above. At points, the canal had to go through some really tough rocky banks of the river. And so rather than try to cut a canal through this steep cliffside here, they just dammed the river up and they made the river into the canal. So this is big slack water. There's several places like this where the boats exited the canal, went into the river, which was like a giant lake, and then went a few miles downstream and then went back into new canal work. I met a lot of people along the way, which I enjoyed. These two women I met at one point, actually, I met them going into the Paw Paw Tunnel, And I noticed they were signing to each other, and I realized they were deaf. And I got to know them, stayed in several towns that they were staying in, got to know them quite well. They're both, one of them worked at Gallaudet College in Washington, which is a college for the deaf. And they were just out riding together along the Cno from Cumberland to Washington. This is at White's Ferry, which is or was, I should say, the last remaining car ferry over the Potomac River. It's about 30 miles from Washington. When it was running, it was a great place that you could cross over the Potomac. It saved a lot of time because there actually aren't that many bridges over the Potomac River when you're around Washington, D.C. Unfortunately, White's Ferry is at the moment closed. There is a disagreement between the ferry owner and the owner of the land on the other side. It's a big sort of local controversy. We're hoping that they'll settle their problem soon, because if you cross over the river, so where we're sitting is on the Maryland side of the North Bank. If you take the ferry across the river to the South Bank on the Virginia side, you're just a few miles from Leesburg, Virginia, which is a very nice town where you could stay. So also in Leesburg, you can pick up another rail trail called the Old Dominion Railroad, which runs all the way from Alexandria, Virginia to Purcellville, Virginia. And you could actually make a big loop by bike if the White's Ferry was still running. The towpath has a reputation for being muddy, and I discovered this. There are also places where trees were down, and I wished I'd had my fenders on my bike. I took them off for some reason in the summer. I often don't have my fenders on my gravel bike in the summer, but I wish I had, because there were a lot of puddles, mud, and I picked up quite a bit of that stuff, and it was all over my back one day. I finally arrived after 7 days at the other end, milepost 0 in Georgetown, which is in Washington, D.C. And if you're going from Pittsburgh to Washington, if the beginning is as dramatic as could be at the point, the other end is about as anticlimactic as could be. You have to really sniff out and find the other end of the towpath. It's not necessarily easy to find. You have to kind of go around through Georgetown, across some bridges, find another bike trail, backtrack over into Georgetown on the other side of a creek, and then go past a boathouse and a boating club. And finally, you find the milepost 0. So if you're looking for a crowd to greet you, you won't find one, but it is a very satisfying place. When I arrived at milepost 0 in Washington, I got back on my bike and I rode about a mile to a metro stop, and I took an elevator down to the station, and you can put your bike on the Washington Metro. And I took it about 30 miles back the other way west to Vienna, Virginia, where the metro stops now, and got out. And my wife picked me up and took me home back to Harrisonburg. And that is the end of my sharing with you. I'd be glad to entertain any questions. Anybody here who's ridden it is glad to share about your experience. Anybody who's thinking of riding it, ask your questions, or anything that I shared with you. If it generated a question, please ask. We have about 5 or 10 minutes still. And you're free to unmute yourself and just ask a question.
Oh, I'm going to start, Russ. Do you, we are actually going the end of September, October. We already have a trip. There's 4 of us going. Do I need to bring, or do we need to bring a bike pump? Or do most of the B&Bs have one?
Most of the B&Bs have one. I would advocate, I have one of these miniature pumps. It's about 6 or 7 inches long. It's very small. It looks like a giant pen, but it actually will pump up to 120 PSI. I would recommend having one along, because there are places in between where you'll find yourself maybe with a flat unattended. Curiously, I actually let the tire pressure down on my bikes when I was on the Cno, because it is so rough. I've got big 42 millimeter tubeless tires, and that kind of took a little bit of the unevenness out of the road. Bring along a small pump, a miniature pump, especially when you got a group of people. Just to say, I've never had a flat in all my years and thousands of miles I've ridden on the Gap. I've never had one. I've just been lucky, but I also maintain my tires well.
Thanks.
Yeah. More questions?
How did you find the places that you were going to stay along the trail?
Yes, I had a guidebook, and the guidebook will give you all the lodging possibilities. There are also some websites, and I'll send you the links to some of the websites. The map I have here, which you get in your guidebook. So the map, it is coded and keyed in such a way that when you look at a place like, let's say, let's say you're going along from Pittsburgh and you go about 30 miles southeast along the gap, you come to the town of West Newton, and if you look at your map, it'll show you that there's everything from parking to restrooms to a bike shop to water and restaurants, campground, and lodging. So the best thing, though, I would say is one of these $10 guides. You can get them online. If you live near there, you can also pick them up. A lot of the towns like West Newton or Ohiopal, Boston have visitor centers. You can pick one up. That's where I pulled my lodging out. I stayed in a mixture of places. What's really nice is in Connellsville. I've lived in or near Connellsville and off and on for 20 years. And in more recent years, they built a beautiful hotel right on the river and the Great Allegheny Passage. So when you're biking past it, you cannot miss that hotel. It's a really nice place to stay. The back deck of the hotel looks over the Yakigani River. Very affordable. There are also quite a few hotels in Cumberland. There are guest houses, hostels, and hotels in Ohiopal. If you like to camp, the best place to camp is Confluence Campground in Confluence, PA. That's about 10 or 12 miles going east from Ohiopal. The town of Confluence also has lots of bed and breakfast. It's a very charming town. The guidebook will give you all the possibilities of where you could stay. When you're going along the Potomac, the Cno, I should say, actually, there are fewer places because it's more remote until you get closer to Washington, D.C. Arthur, you're muted.
There we go. That should work.
We got you.
Okay. I just want to ask the guy who's on below me, Ronald Kuhn, if he grew up in Dearborn, Michigan.
No, I did not. I grew up in New Jersey.
Okay. I had a friend named Ronald Kuhn all the way through school. So.
Oh, well, I'd like to be your friend, but I'm not him.
I should say also is there the Facebook group called, I think it's called the Great Allegheny Passage and Cno Towpath Enthusiasts. And I'm a member, and it's a great group to find lots of information. Looks like John knows about that group. Actually, you don't really need to go on that group and ask a question. You certainly can. But if you just go in and search for a question, there's almost no question that hasn't been asked 10 times and answered 10 times in that Facebook group, including things like about, recommendations for staying or restaurants. I am writing a book about this. It's not a guidebook, but I am writing a book about it. And I will have eventually on my own website as a companion to the book, suggested places to stay and to eat. There are lots of good places to eat along there. Remember, you're going through Western Pennsylvania, so you will also get Western Pennsylvania fare. And if you haven't lived there and know what that is, well, you'll have to experience it. But I love every foot of it, and encourage people to go and ride it because I think I calculated 25 million people live within 2 hours of this route, and on any given weekend, there's a lot of people riding it. Pittsburgh, the former Steel City, which is as hilly and as crazy for driving as could possibly be, is actually a very bike-friendly city. And besides the Great Allegheny Passage, there are numerous other rails trails around it. In fact, there's a trail called the Montour Trail, which completely circumvents almost all of Pittsburgh. It's an old railroad. And a section of that cuts over to Weirton, West Virginia. And someday it will connect to a trails that comes from Cleveland, Ohio. So one day I hope in my lifetime and within the next decade, they'll complete that. And you can actually start in Cleveland, Ohio, and bike all the way to Washington, D.C. on trails. Well, you were a great group. Any more questions before we have to close?
I have a quick question. I was looking on Amazon for the trail book that you mentioned. It lists the 11th edition. And the $10 trail book is listed as a paperback for $178.62.
Yeah, that's if you want a relic called the 11th edition. The one I have is the 16th edition. So you want to look for the most recent edition. And actually, if you go, there's in the link, you'll get a link to the Great Allegheny Passage website.
Mm-hmm.
They'll tell you what the most recent edition is because they generally do a new one every year.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah, I've seen those and I've chuckled because I thought, oh, if I'd only kept one for every year that I had one. I have some old guidebooks. A lot of it is similar year to year. Of course, the history never changes. The hotels and the bed and breakfasts do change a bit. The biggest change over the years has been this map. And again, I wish I'd kept all my old maps because it used to be, you could see the map and there'd be, red, and then there'd be a little section where there was no trail, and then there'd be the trail. And it wasn't actually only until, I want to say, 2013 or 2014 that you could really go all the way from Pittsburgh, because I used to lead these groups and we would have to stop short of Pittsburgh because we couldn't get into the city. There are a few spots where you go around. Mckeesport, 15 miles from Pittsburgh, you have to jog through the city a little bit. It's very well marked, however.
Do you know, does Road Scholar still have that program?
I don't, and I've wondered about it because it was a Road Scholar program run out of Laurelville Camp, which is in Mount Pleasant, PA. And I was just thinking recently about looking into it. The last time I did a Road Scholars group was in 2016. That was actually the first time I was able to ride all the way to Pittsburgh, because the groups I led in 2009, 2010, we had to stop short of Pittsburgh. And actually the other thing they opened more recently was the Pinkerton Tunnel. They had to reline all those tunnels. But it's an amazing job. Yeah.
Thank you.
John.
Yes. Do you know, I've seen mixed reports about this as to whether the Pawpaw Tunnel is you're actually able to get through it or not. I know it's officially closed.
You cannot get through it because you could actually walk from one end all the way to the other end, but then you'd stop. At the southern end, I didn't show a picture of it, the canal, the channel actually gets very narrow and has very steep sides, and the towpath is actually like a boardwalk along the edge for about 100 more yards, and that is all closed. So unfortunately, you would get to the other end and you can't go any further, and you'd have to turn around and walk back. So you actually could go to the Pawpaw. If you want to go in it, you can, but you can't go through it. It is a bit of a hike up over, and if you look at that Facebook group, there's a lot of discussion about people that have taken it. It's a great group because people will go out and take photos of trail conditions. The other thing to watch out, I didn't show you a picture of it, but there are trees down occasionally on the Cno, especially if there's been a rainstorm. And I encountered one of those. Fortunately, there was an easy detour around it. But yeah, the Pawpaw is closed until next summer, which is too bad.
It seemed like some people said, well, they got to that point and they just went overland or something, or went around it somehow, even though there wasn't anybody working at the time.
Well, that's possible. I wouldn't risk it. You can go up. There's a trail that goes up and over it, and they say the hardest part of the bike is getting your bike up the trail, and then once you're on there, it's pretty flat on the top. It's actually not that long, but when you're hauling a bike and weight up and over, it takes you some time. Well, thanks, everybody. You're a great group. I enjoyed sharing my enthusiasm with the Great Allegheny Passage and Cno Towpath with you. And hope you all have a chance to get out and bike this week if you're cyclists.
Thank you.
Thanks,
Thank you.
Russ.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Have a great evening.
Thank you.
Good night, everybody.
Good night, Ron Kuhn.
And by the way,
Good night, Arthur.
someone asked in the chat if there's going to be a link. Yes, I will make sure there's a link.
Okay, thanks.
The official guide. Good night.
Great.
Good night.
Good night.
See you on the trails.